No matter what country you live in, most of us are all in a world of trouble. Imagine this. You're standing in a stadium, the crowd roaring as your country's flag is raised high. The anthem plays, and you feel it, a swell of pride, unity, and belonging. Something that most of us probably felt before the November presidential election. Now the other half of the stadium is wondering if they should stand at all, and are looking at the prideful, roaring crowd with fear and derision. This is the America we live in today, and most of the rest of the world face similar predicaments in their own countries. This will impact our ability to have our voice heard by government and society. This is a threat to worldwide safety, security, standard of living, quality of life, as well as to our ability to combat climate change. We must all protect democracy, freedom, and support equality, justice, human and minority rights, and demand checks and balances and separation of powers, and demand resilience, fortitude, reason, compassion, and civic virtue and engagement. We need to know that we're not alone, that no matter where you're from, we must face and confront these trying times together. And we have to believe and hope that by our combined strength, we can truly build worldwide equality and feel, for the first time in human history, a sense of belonging for everyone, true human and civil rights for all. And we can even have a world at peace. We can achieve it. This is our moment. We shouldn't be in a stadium fighting each other. We should be working for true liberty, equality, fraternity for everyone. Finally, isn't it time? Because if we don't, we'll just see more climate destruction, wars, famine, genocide, migration, intolerance, hatred, greed, poverty, corruption, and inhumanity. I cover the whys and hows in my other videos. All of this for the allure of nationalism. It can, or at least used to be able to, draw us together, binding us through shared symbols, language, and history. But have you ever wondered, beneath the spectacle, what nationalism truly represents? At its core, nationalism is a belief in the supremacy of one's nation as the cornerstone of identity and governance. Civic nationalism appeals to ideals of shared governance and rights, while ethnic nationalism binds people through ancestry, language, or religion. Both forms are potent, sparking revolutions, movements, and wars. But what happens when the pride turns possessive, or the unity excludes others? Nationalism's promise can quickly twist into a destructive force, setting the stage for division rather than harmony. This isn't a story of heroes and villains. It's about understanding how nationalism rose to power and why it now struggles to serve us in a rapidly darker and changing world. I felt goosebumps from that last sentence. Nationalism's promises of unity and progress have often masked deeper fractures, leaving societies vulnerable to fear and division. To find the answers, we must journey to its roots. The seeds of nationalism sprouted in the fertile soil of the Enlightenment. As monarchies crumbled and empires fragmented, people sought new ways to define their collective identity. The French Revolution in 1789 roared with cries of liberté, égalité, fraternité, signaling the rise of nationalism as a modern force. It wasn't just about borders, it was about the people defining their destiny, or so we were told. While the seeds may have been planted in the Enlightenment, it was powerful and populist leaders that pushed these narratives while enriching themselves and their collaborators. Napoleon crowning himself emperor in 1804 is a perfect symbol of how nationalism, while promising liberation and unity, often empowered populist tyrants at the expense of society, religion, and the very lands they claimed to liberate. By seizing the crown from the Pope and placing it on his own head, Napoleon rejected the traditional authority of the Church, signaling that national power now superseded religious or moral checks. His rule embodied the paradox of nationalism. It galvanized the masses under the banner of French pride and revolutionary ideals while centralizing power in a single autocratic figure. For French society, this shift eroded the egalitarian promises of the revolution, replacing them with militarism and conscription to fuel endless wars. Religiously, Napoleon's actions undermined the spiritual and ethical underpinnings that once tempered political ambition, turning the church into a subservient tool of the state. Meanwhile, in the territories he sought to liberate, such as Egypt, Spain, Italy, and Germany, his campaigns brought not freedom, but devastation. These lands were exploited for resources, their cultures suppressed, and their populations subjected to occupation, all under the guise of spreading revolutionary ideals. This rebuke is by no means a sign of support for his enemies in the war. For another example of how the rich and powerful manipulate nationalism and create and profit by wars, look no further than British commander Arthur Wellesley, afterward Duke of Wellington. Arthur Wellesley masterfully leveraged nationalism and his military position to secure personal wealth, titles, and influence, becoming one of Britain's most celebrated figures. His rise to the dukedom, a title conferred as a reward for his military victories during the Napoleonic Wars, exemplifies how individuals can use war, national pride, and political maneuvering to advance their own status. Wellesley capitalized on Britain's growing nationalism during the early 19th century. His victories in the Peninsular War and at the Battle of Waterloo were portrayed as heroic triumphs that preserved British sovereignty and European stability against Napoleon's imperial ambitions. His military campaigns became symbols of British resilience and superiority, and Wellesley himself was celebrated as the embodiment of patriotic duty and leadership. This public adulation was critical in building his reputation and justifying the rewards he received. Wellesley's military successes were accompanied by significant financial and territorial rewards. No sooner than Colonel Wellesley arrived in India, he began to amass wealth through prize money and political appointments, often in questionable ways. For example, during his time in India for the East India Company, Wellesley was involved in exploiting local rulers and redistributing their wealth to the British government, earning personal financial benefits in the process. He secured favorable land grants and pensions as recognition for his military service. His eventual elevation to Duke of Wellington in 1814 was less about merit alone and more about the political and nationalist climate that celebrated military leaders as saviors of the nation. All of this by taking the Indian subcontinent through impoverishing and murdering millions. Indian fans, what do you think of Arthur Wellesley today? Initially, Wellesley was not an outspoken proponent of war, but as a career military officer, he recognized its potential to elevate his status and influence. While he followed orders during the Napoleonic conflicts, his pragmatism and loyalty to Britain's imperial goals aligned him with the war effort. He was, however, known for his political savvy and ability to navigate shifting alliances and agendas, making him indispensable to Britain's military and political elite, skills that he would use to his advantage as Prime Minister, also known as the worst Prime Minister of the 19th century. Crossing the Channel back from Wellington to Napoleon's self-coronation, it reveals nationalism's dark side, a tool that can unify and inspire, but also concentrate power in the hands of a few, turning liberation into conquest and leaving societies and nations worse off than before. The Industrial Revolution further fueled the shift to nationalism. Factories and railroads unified fragmented regions, creating shared economies and experiences. Villages far from the capital and cities became interconnected with transportation, media, education, and bureaucracies. Opportunists and states melded language, myth, and patriotism together at the expense of multiculturalism. Suddenly, nationalism became the thread weaving disparate provinces into cohesive nations. But as its power grew, so did its reach and its darker potential. The same nationalism that inspired revolutions also justified the conquest of lands and peoples, birthing empires under the guise of civilizing others. What began as a liberating idea began morphing into a tool of domination, setting up a pattern of exploitation and exclusion that echoes through history. Colonialism was nationalism's grand stage. European powers, brimming with pride in their superior civilizations, carved up continents, painting the world in their colors. They justified their greed through the narrative of national greatness, branding other cultures as inferior, savage, or needing salvation. Colonialism underwent a profound transformation as it shifted from being a tool of monarchic expansion under the kings and queens of Spain, Portugal, and England to a nationalist-driven endeavor that exploited racism as a means of control and justification. Initially, colonialism was largely motivated by religious zeal, royal ambition, and the pursuit of wealth, often sanctioned by religious decrees such as papal bulls and edicts that cloaked greed in divine approval. One of the most infamous of these was the Doctrine of Discovery, issued under Pope Alexander VI, a corrupt figure whose personal and political machinations exemplify how colonialism and racism were intertwined for personal and institutional gain. The Doctrine of Discovery granted Spain and Portugal the right to claim lands inhabited by non-Christians, justifying the conquest and exploitation of the Americas and Africa. This decree wasn't issued out of altruism, but as part of Pope Alexander's corrupt strategy to consolidate power and enrich himself and his allies. Known for his nepotism, bribery, and scandalous personal life, Alexander VI used his position to elevate his illegitimate children, such as Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, and to secure vast wealth through the expansion of Christendom, a thinly veiled euphemism for territorial greed. All of Pope Alexander VI's acknowledged children were born while he was a member of the clergy, and by this time, celibacy was a formal requirement for priests and higher-ranking church officials. As a cardinal and later pope, Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, was bound by the vow of celibacy, but his behavior flagrantly contradicted the church's teachings and expectations. Rodrigo Borgia was made a cardinal in 1456 by his uncle, Pope Calixtus III. As a cardinal, he held significant influence and wealth, and during this time, he began fathering children, most notably with his mistress, Vanozza de Catane. He later became the vice-chancellor of the church. That's the second in command of the Roman Catholic Church. This position, which he held for decades before becoming pope, gave him immense administrative power within the Vatican and allowed him to accumulate significant wealth, which he used to further his family's ambitions. His papacy was notorious for its nepotism and corruption, much of which was directed toward securing his children's power and influence. The vow of celibacy, required of Roman Catholic priests since at least the First Lateran Council of 1123, was fully expected of cardinals and the Pope. However, enforcement varied widely, and many clergy, including Rodrigo Borgia, flouted the rule. Despite his flagrant disregard for this vow, his wealth, connections, and political savvy allowed him to maintain his position and ascend to the papacy. Rodrigo Borgia's rise and continued influence, despite his open flouting of celibacy, reflect the deep corruption within the church during this period. Nepotism, bribery, and political alliances were common, and his wealth and strategic maneuvering protected him from serious consequences. When he became pope, Alexander VI fully leveraged his position to advance his children's fortunes, marrying them into powerful families and granting them titles, lands, and influence. Yes, Pope Alexander VI's children were born while he was bound by vows of celibacy, first as a cardinal and later as pope. His blatant disregard for this requirement, combined with the systemic corruption of the Church at the time, made him one of the most scandalous figures in papal history. His legacy is a stark reminder of the Church's vulnerability to human failings during this period of its history. He is probably the best example of why religious tyranny is as dangerous or even more so than nationalism. And if the two of these combine, we'll discuss that convergence a little later. But back to the Pope. Alexander VI personally benefited from the systemic racism underpinning these policies. By declaring non-Christian peoples as inferior and subject to conquest, he legitimized the seizure of lands, resources, and human lives. This dehumanization not only enriched the Vatican, but also allowed European monarchs to plunder with moral impunity, funneling wealth back to the Church and its leaders. The exploitation of indigenous populations, the introduction of chattel slavery like that practiced in America, and the decimation of cultures were direct results of these decrees. For my Native American perspective on this topic, check out my video, Thanksgiving and the National Day of Mourning next. Why does Alexander VI remind me so much of Donald Trump? This stark racial hierarchy was not inherent to European thought. In ancient Greece and Rome, while prejudice existed, it was based more on culture, language, and conquest than on inherent biological differences. Greeks considered non-Greeks as barbarians, but this term described cultural practices, not immutable racial traits. Romans were similarly inclusive, integrating conquered peoples into their empire as citizens, regardless of skin color or ethnicity. At least 2 Roman emperors were black, as well as some very powerful women. They were also much more open in many ways than we are towards sexuality and homosexuality than we have today, a spirit that left Europe after Vatican hegemony and until the Renaissance. We need to return to that Renaissance spirit. We need to return to their sense of civic pride, civic virtue, civic engagement, and civitas, but on a global scale for human equality and education and food and housing for all, and one democracy. That video is coming soon. I have to finish my big video book story for Christmas first. It's a new take on some traditional classics that I'd advise parents to watch before they let their children do. It presents Santa as a man, and it discusses topics of discrimination and climate change, as well as the dignified death of a beloved animal. But it's a story of hope and resilience, something that I think we all need right now. It's part of my holiday and cultural icon videos. But back to race. The idea that people were fundamentally different based on race only emerged much later, as nationalist European powers sought to justify their colonial ambitions. Colonialism took on a more destructive and systemic form under nationalist states in the 18th and 19th centuries. While monarchic colonialism was centered on expanding royal domains and spreading Christianity, nationalist colonialism framed conquest as a duty to the nation. This transformation was fueled by the pseudo-scientific concept of race, which categorized people into rigid hierarchies to legitimize exploitation. The Industrial Revolution deepened this trend, as nationalist colonial powers like Britain and France sought resources and markets to fuel their economies, as well as extract other countries' resources for their own gain. For the colonized, this new form of colonialism was worse. Under nationalism, colonies were not just territories to be ruled, but integral to the economic and ideological fabric of the nation-state. Entire populations were forced into brutal labor systems to extract resources, and local economies were dismantled to serve the interests of the colonizers. Nationalist propaganda framed these efforts as civilizing missions, erasing the agency, cultures, and histories of colonized peoples. Even in the colonizers' home countries, nationalism used colonialism to foster a sense of pride among the population, including the economically marginalized. Propaganda glorified the empire, portraying colonization as a national triumph that elevated the homeland's global standing. For those living in poverty, this imperial pride offered a sense of belonging and superiority, even though they saw no direct economic benefit. Nationalism made them complicit in a system that enriched elites while sowing division and suffering abroad. And this is not just a history lesson. If you want a modern example of this entrenched thinking, look no further than Christian nationalism in the United States or the Brexit movement in England. Colonialism's evolution from a monarchic endeavor to a nationalist project shows how greed, propaganda, and racism were weaponized to amass wealth and power. The Doctrine of Discovery and the corruption of figures like Pope Alexander VI highlight how institutions cloaked greed in moral and religious justification, laying the groundwork for centuries of exploitation. What began as a quest for territory and wealth became a systematized mechanism for concentrating power and dehumanizing entire populations, both in the colonies and at home. And look at the world it's created. Nearly 2 billion of us live in poverty. Many have no protections from climate, inflation, depressions, or war. Look at the 44,000, mostly women and children in Gaza, who have died thus far because of the dark and capricious whims of Benjamin Netanyahu, a modern-day Napoleon. But at least Napoleon had some redeeming qualities. But I digress. Or the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have died at the hands of Putin and his supporters, including millions of complicit Russians, North Koreans, and the American politicians that support him. Again, no redeeming qualities like Napoleon. And what about Donald Trump? Would the far right be aghast if he crowned himself emperor? Would they even care? By understanding this history, we can begin to dismantle the structures of divisiveness and inequality it left behind, and how to combat racism, prejudice, and discrimination in the modern world. And with a Trump presidency, this doesn't bode well for anyone who isn't a white, moderately well-off, straight, Christian evangelicals in neighborhoods or gated communities with other white, moderately well-off, straight, Christian evangelicals. So that number doesn't even include most of the roughly 30% of Americans who are or who sympathize with Christian nationalism. For those not familiar, Christian nationalism is a political and religious ideology that merges Christianity with national identity, asserting that a nation's laws, culture, and governance should reflect specific Christian values, often at the expense of pluralism and secularism. Its dangers to outsiders and non-adherents lie in its exclusionary nature, which marginalizes minority faiths, atheists, and dissenters, framing them as threats to the nation's moral and cultural fabric. While its core aim is to establish a theocratic governance model where Christianity interpreted narrowly dominates public life, often undermining democratic principles by limiting individual freedoms for everyone else. If you look at PRRI's maps of states with higher numbers of Christian nationalist support, you shouldn't be surprised by Trump's election. I'd venture to say that this was the majority of his support in the election. The rest were frustrated, angry, or fearful Americans who felt left behind by the Democrats. That's why I call for any like-minded souls to check out my videos on what's next for the Democratic Party and my videos on why the Democratic Party needs to return to its tradition base of the poor, the working and middle class, and return to the equality and humanity of FDR. We need an America who will look out for all Americans and not just the corporations we toil for, buy from, and depend on. We need to take the party back not only to protect our interests, but to keep Trump and his Christian nationalists, the modern-day conquistadors and pilgrims. Is that what Trump means when he says, "Make America great again"? I hope not. Nationalism, racism, and colonialism became deeply intertwined through the toxic fusion of pseudo-science, propaganda, religion, and greed, shaping a narrative that justified exploitation, oppression, and conquest. During the 18th and 19th centuries, pseudo-scientific theories such as phrenology and social Darwinism falsely categorized humanity into races, ranking them in a hierarchy that conveniently placed colonial powers and their citizens at the top. These fabricated hierarchies provided a veneer of legitimacy for the expansion of empires and the brutal subjugation of people in colonized territories. Propaganda amplified these ideas, depicting colonized peoples as inferior, savage, or in need of salvation, while religion was often weaponized to frame colonialism and racial hierarchies as part of a divine plan. Nationalism, with its focus on cultural and racial superiority, worked hand in hand with colonial ambitions, portraying the conquest of lands and peoples as a moral duty and a source of national pride. Greed drove this system, with the wealth extracted from colonized nations, from resources to human labor enriching imperial powers and deepening the global inequality built on these racist and nationalist foundations. Colonialism spread these myths across continents, embedding racism into the very fabric of society and creating enduring legacies of division and injustice. Yet, the concept of race itself is a relatively recent invention, rooted not in science, but in socially constructed lies designed to divide and control. Modern genetics reveals that humanity shares a common ancestry, with more genetic diversity within so-called races than between them. In truth, we are one interconnected species, and the artificial divisions created by nationalism, racism, and colonialism obscure our shared history and mutual interdependence. Recognizing this truth is essential to dismantling the harmful legacies of the past and building a more united and equitable future. This mindset planted deep roots. Us versus them is nationalism's cruel offspring, fostering suspicion and division. Even today, xenophobia, immigration bans, and cultural clashes trace their lineage to this colonial heritage. Nationalism promised to unify. Instead, it fragmented the world into competing tribes, eroding the empathy that binds humanity. What's more sobering is what nationalism replaced: an earlier form of unity that transcended borders. Before nationalism, identities were shaped less by borders and more by faith, fealty, and shared values. Christendom, the feudal order, and even the ancient Roman concept of civitas citizenship, tied to shared rights, offered a broader vision of connection. But the Enlightenment rejected these old bonds, seeking freedom from oppressive hierarchies. Nationalism stepped in as the new unifier, but it came with a price: the fragmentation of global consciousness. What might have been a step toward universal values became a rigid framework for exclusion. This rigidity set the stage for nationalism's most dangerous mutations. History shows us what happens when nationalism runs unchecked. Fascism weaponized national pride, turning it into a tool for terror. Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy revealed how quickly love for one's country can morph into hatred for others. More recently, ultra-nationalism has resurfaced in populist movements like Donald Trump's America First agenda. These ideologies isolate nations, erode democratic norms, and abandon global cooperation. Christian nationalism takes this danger further, fusing religious identity with political power. In the US, it promotes exclusionary policies, blending patriotism with divine authority. Nationalism, once a unifier, now splinters societies, leaving us ill-equipped to face global crises like climate change, pollution, growing wealth inequality, pandemics, and nuclear proliferation. Faced with nationalism's failures, we must ask, is there an alternative? Enter the idea of global citizenship, the belief that we belong not just to one nation, but to humanity. It's no utopian dream. Examples abound. The United Nations fosters peace. Climate accords tackle shared threats. Global charities mobilize compassion across borders. Imagine a world where education emphasizes our common humanity, where policies reward cooperation, and where empathy transcends flags and languages. Let's look at the European Union as a case study. Created in the aftermath of two devastating world wars, the EU was designed to bind nations together through economic cooperation, shared governance, and a collective commitment to peace. Its architects envisioned a continent where war was not just unlikely, but impossible, thanks to interconnected economies and cultures. Today, many citizens of EU member states see themselves not only as French, German, or Italian, but as Europeans, and, more broadly, as citizens of the world. The EU reflects the ancient Roman idea of civitas, where citizenship transcends local loyalties to embrace a larger collective bound by shared rights, responsibilities, and civic virtue. By fostering a culture of democracy, human rights, and multilateralism, the EU has transcended the petty concerns of nationalism, creating a model for how diverse nations can cooperate for mutual benefit. Policies such as open borders, the euro currency, and joint environmental initiatives exemplify what global citizenship can look like in practice. Yet, the EU is not without challenges. Nationalist movements within member states, from Brexit and far-right populist parties, seek to undo decades of progress by appealing to fear and division. These forces argue for a return to isolationism and national sovereignty, undermining the EU's unity. The EU remains a fragile yet inspiring example of how supranational governance can succeed and a reminder of how easily it can be threatened. Should more regions follow the EU's lead? Imagine a North American Union where the United States, Canada, and Mexico pool resources to tackle climate change, migration, and economic inequality, or an African Union that moves beyond its current political framework to a more unified federation. The benefits are clear: shared resources, collective security, and a stronger voice on the global stage. But achieving this requires careful balancing of local identities with global priorities, strong leadership, and a shared vision of what it means to belong to something greater than oneself. The transition to supranational entities like the EU isn't easy, but it is possible. Through education that emphasizes interconnectedness, policies that reward cooperation, and cultural shifts that value empathy over fear, we can move toward a future where national borders no longer limit our sense of belonging. The EU offers a glimpse of what this future could hold if we're bold enough to embrace it. By stepping beyond nationalism and embracing models like the EU, we can aspire to a world that not only addresses shared challenges, but celebrates our shared humanity. The danger, of course, is even stronger, more resourceful supernations. While supranationalism has its merits, blocs like North America or Europe are not truly representative of the global community of humanity. We are, after all, one race, one species. Our DNA 99.9% the same. There's no logical, reasonable, or compassionate reason to stick populations in camps of us versus them. But can we truly achieve this? The answer lies in small steps. By embracing cultural exchange, supporting global initiatives, and rejecting the fear-based rhetoric of nationalism, we can shift the tide. Nationalism has taken us far, but it's a relic of a world that no longer exists. Today, we face challenges that demand unity over division, cooperation over competition, and a shared vision of the future. Thank you for watching. Our channel, Renaissance Spirit, is dedicated to a just, equitable, and humanitarian world. We explore history, politics, culture, and society with an eye toward building a brighter future, one rooted in knowledge, empathy, and action. Just as the Renaissance reignited the human spirit through learning and discovery, we believe in rekindling that flame today. If you're ready to embrace truth, grow as a person, and explore the beauty of our shared history, subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and join us on this journey. Be sure to explore our other videos, take the quiz to discover your Renaissance spirit, and let us know how we can shape our shared story. Together, we can live the Renaissance spirit and make history a living, breathing part of our future.